Hey, what's up everyone? So this is going to be the 81st opening that I'd like to share with you, which is the bat opening, otherwise known as cow bat or the Cambridge opening. So over here, let's run through the sequence. It's basically a lead up to the diagonal, typical diagonal, and then black goes to the cow. That's why it's kind of called the cow bat as well. It leads up to the bat opening. So over here, white does the standard E3 cut through. And then over here, instead of black going for d3, this opening I would say is initiated by black because typically the variation of this opening tends to lead towards this situation whereby black can choose to just follow the book or choose to variate. So basically, bat is initiated once black plays e7 in response to the e3 move. So e3 being the hit, and then of course black just kind of chipping off diagonally, going to the tail end of it, just flipping one disc, and just setting up that opening. So I would say that this surprises the opponent somehow because typically you would expect this to be the best book opening and for black to kind of follow it. But this is kind of like a minor surprise because most players who don't play this tend to play for perhaps the bat opening or maybe even the tank opening at f3, but we'll cover that one later. So e7, I would say, together with the other two options are the top three options. So there is a surprise factor. Perhaps your opponent probably won't know it as well as he knows d3. It limits options for white, yes, to some extent, because playable moves are 1, 2, 3, 4. The most common move that I see being played in response to this bat opening is the c7. It's basically a cut across for black, a diagonal cut, and of course a white's kind of cross back along the d6 disc. And then over here, instead of black going to f3, the more common sequence that I see, almost played every time, is d7. d7 for black to kind of form that regroup shape over here. You can see this being just regrouped. And then, of course, white jumping into the center. So this is kind of a very common sequence for a bat follow-up. You kind of lose a slight advantage potentially, but I would say this opening is easy for both your opponent and yourself to follow up, in the sense that most of the moves are fairly intuitive actually. So you have to go deep in book if you want to have some sort of advantage against your opponent. If you're playing an opponent who you think is stronger than you, then perhaps for intermediate players it's best to kind of play this variation so that you can go deep in book and you probably wouldn't lose that huge a margin. So over here, it's almost quite easy to decide that you want to just flip one disc, maintain a center shape. Another variation that I see pretty often that is being played is d3. Even though it cuts four discs in two different directions, it's still maintaining the center shape. And if white were to play the best move to f4, it gives up an easy move on the tail end of it to f7. Or black can actually, something that I see pretty often is also b5, which poisons the b6 disc because of this disc that's been established at e3. So white wouldn't play either or c4 or b6, either one white wouldn't play. And instead white would have to be forced to play the e8 sequence, which kind of begs a sequence over here to kind of feed the unbalanced edge. White defends to form up the five disc unbalanced edge instead of just a 3 disc attackable unbalanced edge. It's a lot safer for white to kind of establish the edge rather than leave one hanging. So instead of this shape, you probably prefer to form this shape and allow black to kind of feed off this edge and for you to kind of consolidate the edge so that it's a more clear cut. But of course, the best move over here would be actually for black to kind of prevent this first, to kind of make white chase a little on the excess towards d8, given that there's no rush, there's no black disc on b6. So if we didn't play that poison move, then yes, if we were to play b5 instead of d3, then white goes to f4, and then black jumps into d3. So I think, f4 being a regrouping move to the center, the box, just flipping one disc, keeping a compact shape at the same time white controls this. It's fairly intuitive, so I would say it's easy. Black jumps into d3, another center cut through. Black doesn't have access to c4, there's no clean move, so an option would be for black to play g6 to kind of re-establish e6 to give access to c4. That's possible as well. But just bear in mind that g6 and d3, these two positions or these two squares are definitely poisoning one another. And of course, if you consider a mid-game logic, a simple kind of rule of thumb that is kind of also taught to me by previous world champions, is that if you look at G6 and if you look at D3, both are poisoning one another because of this mini diagonal between E4 and F5 that are linked. Which one would you rather have first? So definitely you want the disk. You want to place the disk that is more um, easily removed. So in the future, your opponent might potentially remove the D3 disk and unpoison this diagonal, and then you can then play this G6. But if you play G6, and it's a lot less likely that white removes G6 in the future that unpoisons and allow you to play D3, then definitely you should play D3 first. So I think that's probably the kind of minor difference that you can kind of understand between D3 creating the access at D5 to go to F7, or G6 to create that access at E6 to go to C4 to kind of cut back into the center. So yeah, this is very important just to kind of figure out the differences in the mid game so that you can probably selectively choose. Another rule of thumb is to potentially choose the move that is more closer to the center of the board, because as both players play around the board, there's a higher chance that you or your opponent might end up at the outside of the parameter, and therefore flipping the discs that are placed in the center of the board rather than those along the outer parameter. Yeah, so that's basic rule of thumb. So this is kind of like the standard sequence. So if we play this black, white, black, white, black, so it's kind of like the sequence that we talked about earlier, whereby white would want to consolidate the unbalanced edge first and kind of pull black, towards his side while black maintains his side. So I would say this sequence, it's very easy. It's almost like a rose kind of rotating flat where all the moves are intuitive. Both players can almost play the correct moves very quickly. So if I were a strong player, I probably wouldn't want to go for this opening against a weaker player. If I'm facing a world class player, then maybe I could consider playing this and try to keep or try to maintain the position whereby it's still rather even, so that I have some of the chances to kind of score a close game, or at least potentially a draw towards the end. So yeah, something to think about, and thank you very much for joining me, and we'll just cover this opening up to this point, and hopefully it works for you, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.